School photographers, what did you notice in years of archived class photos that helped police identify a missing child? I was digitizing the 2012 kindergarten photos when I saw her. The girl in the third row had the same distinctive birthmark on her left cheek, the same wide-set green eyes, the same slight gap between her front teeth. I'd been a school photographer for 15 years, shooting thousands of students across 6 elementary schools in the district, and I'd developed an eye for faces. This face was familiar, but it shouldn't have been. The girl's name, according to the photo database, was Emma Karolak, enrolled at Riverside Elementary, but I knew her as someone else. I pulled up my archive from 2009 and found what I was looking for. A different school, Northbrook Elementary, a different last name, the same face, 3 years younger, labeled as Lily Brennan. My hands started shaking as I opened more files, tracing backwards. 2008, another school, another name, Maya Torres. Same birthmark, same eyes, same child. I'd photographed this girl at 4 different schools, under 4 different identities over 5 years. That wasn't normal. That was someone deliberately moving a child through the system, changing her identity each time. I grabbed my phone and called the school district office, asking for someone in student records. They transferred me 3 times before I reached a supervisor named Janet Kowalski. I explained what I'd found. The same child photographed under multiple names at different schools. Janet went quiet for a long moment, then asked me to send her the photos immediately. I emailed them from my workstation and waited while she pulled up the enrollment records. When she came back on the line, her voice was tight and controlled. Each enrollment used different guardians. The 2008 enrollment listed parents as Carlos and Sofia Torres. The 2009 enrollment listed a single mother, Amanda Brennan. The 2012 enrollment listed adoptive parents, Derek and Susan Karolak. None of these people are related according to our background check system. Mr. Huang, I need to report this to the police immediately. Can you stay available for questions? I said yes and gave her my cell number. After we hung up, I went through my entire archive systematically, searching for any other anomalies. I found 2 more children who appeared under different names at different schools, though their patterns weren't as extensive as the first girl's. One boy appeared twice over 3 years with different last names. Another girl appeared 3 times over 4 years. My stomach was churning by the time I documented everything. This wasn't coincidental paperwork errors. This was systematic identity manipulation of children. Detective Ryan Okafor called me that evening while I was still at my studio going through files. He asked if I could come to the police station the next morning with all the documentation I'd found. I arrived at 8 with my laptop and a folder of printed photos organized by child and chronology. Detective Okafor was in his early 40s, with sharp eyes and a methodical way of working through information. He had me walk through each case, explaining how I'd identified the patterns and what made me certain these were the same children rather than siblings or coincidental resemblances. I showed him the distinctive markers, the birthmark on the first girl, a scar above the eyebrow on the boy, a unique eye color pattern on the second girl. Okafor took notes and asked detailed questions about the photo metadata, the dates, the schools, the enrollment information. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and told me something that made my blood run cold. The first girl you identified, the one you called Emma Karolak in your most recent photos, she's been reported missing. The Karolak family filed a report 6 weeks ago saying their adopted daughter disappeared from school and never came home. My mouth went dry. She's missing right now? Okafor nodded. We've been investigating it as a possible custodial interference situation. The adoption was recent, and we thought maybe the biological parents had taken her. But what you've shown me suggests something much more organized. This child has been moved through the system multiple times with different identities. That's trafficking, not custodial interference. He pulled out a file and showed me the missing person report. The photo was recent, taken just months before she vanished. It was definitely the same girl I'd photographed over the years. Emma, or whatever her real name was. Okafor asked if I'd noticed anything unusual when I photographed her most recently. I thought back to that session at Riverside Elementary in September, 2 months before she disappeared. She'd been quiet and compliant, sitting exactly where I positioned her, no fidgeting or smiling. Most kids that age couldn't sit still or made silly faces. She'd been almost robotic in her stillness. I told Okafor that detail, and he wrote it down. That's consistent with a child who's been trained to be invisible, to not draw attention. Kids in trafficking situations often develop that behavior. Okafor brought in another detective, a woman named Lisa Chen, who specialized in crimes against children. She took over the questioning, asking more specific details about each photo session, whether I'd interacted with the guardians who'd brought the children, whether I'd noticed anything concerning. I explained that school photographers typically worked through the school administration, not directly with parents. The kids came to our setup area in groups. We photographed them quickly and efficiently, and they went back to class. I rarely saw guardians unless they came to pick up photo packages later. But I did remember one interaction with the woman who'd been listed as Emma's adoptive mother, Susan Karolak. She'd come to pick up the photo package in October, just weeks before Emma vanished. Susan had been nervous, constantly checking her phone, asking multiple times when the photos would be ready, even though I'd already told her. She'd paid in cash, which was unusual since most people paid online or with credit cards. When I handed her the package, she'd barely glanced at the photos before leaving quickly. At the time, I'd thought she was just stressed or in a hurry. Now it seemed more significant. Chen asked if I could describe Susan Karolak. I pulled up the school's visitor log photos from that day. Most schools required visitors to sign in and have their photo taken for security. I found Susan's entry and showed it to Chen. The detective stared at the image for several seconds, then pulled out her phone and made a call. She spoke quietly for a few minutes, then hung up and looked at Okafor. That's Jennifer Marks. She's been on our radar for 2 years as part of a suspected adoption fraud network. She uses multiple aliases and has connections to at least 3 agencies that facilitate questionable international adoptions. We haven't been able to build a case against her because the adoptions technically go through legal channels, but we've suspected she's involved in something larger. Okafor swore quietly. So Emma, or whoever she really is, was placed with a known fraud operator? Chen nodded. And 6 weeks ago, she disappeared right before we were planning to interview the Karolaks about their adoption process. That's not coincidence. She looked at me. The pattern you identified suggests these children are being moved through the system deliberately. New identities, new schools, keeping them visible enough to seem legitimate, but moving them frequently enough that no one forms attachments or asks questions. Chen asked if I had photos of the guardians associated with the other children I'd identified. I didn't have visitor logs from all the schools, but I pulled up what I had. The man listed as Carlos Torres in 2008 appeared in one visitor log. Chen's expression changed when she saw his photo. She showed it to Okafor, who nodded grimly. That's Raymond Pratt. He's connected to Jennifer Marks. We've documented them attending meetings together at an adoption law office downtown. He presents himself as a social worker, but he's not licensed in this state. The pieces were connecting in ways that made me feel sick. These children were being trafficked through what looked like legitimate adoption placements, moved through schools under different identities to maintain the appearance of normal family structures while actually being controlled by a criminal network. Chen asked if I'd be willing to testify about the photo evidence and help investigators identify additional children who might be caught in this system. I said absolutely, whatever they needed. She told me to go home and send her my complete archive, every photo and metadata file I had from the past 10 years. We're going to go through every image looking for more victims and more perpetrators. This is bigger than one missing girl. This is an organization. I spent the next 2 days organizing and uploading my complete archive to a secure police server. 15 years of school photography, hundreds of thousands of images. I flagged every case where I'd noticed the same child appearing under different names, finding 12 total instances spanning various years and schools. Each case followed a similar pattern, children appearing in my photos for 1 or 2 years before vanishing and reappearing elsewhere with new identities. The more I looked, the more I saw things I'd missed before. Children who looked uncomfortable or fearful in photos, children who appeared underweight or showed signs of neglect, children who never smiled, never relaxed, never looked like the other kids. I'd been photographing evidence of trafficking for years without realizing it. The guilt was crushing, but Chen told me not to blame myself when she called with updates. You had no reason to suspect this. School photographers see thousands of kids. You couldn't have known that identical faces in different years with different names meant trafficking rather than divorced parents with custody changes or families relocating. The fact that you noticed the pattern now is what matters. Chen said the investigation was expanding rapidly. They'd brought in FBI agents who specialized in child trafficking and were cross-referencing my photos with missing children databases. So far, they'd identified 5 of the 12 children I'd flagged as kids who'd been reported missing or abducted from other states. The children had been trafficked across state lines, given new identities through fraudulent documents, and placed with fake families who moved them through school systems to maintain legitimacy. The FBI was now investigating the adoption agencies and law offices connected to Jennifer Marks and Raymond Pratt, looking for the full scope of the network. Chen asked if I could come back to the station to help with photo identification. They'd assembled a task force and needed someone with my experience recognizing faces to go through surveillance footage and additional records. I cleared my schedule and spent the next week working with investigators, comparing my archive photos to images from other sources. We identified 3 more adults connected to the trafficking network by matching visitor logs from different schools. Each person had used multiple names and appeared at different schools during the time frames when trafficked children were enrolled there. The breakthrough came when FBI agents raided the law office that had processed many of the fraudulent adoptions. They found records documenting over 40 children who'd been moved through their system in the past 8 years. Each child had been taken from vulnerable situations, usually from other countries or from families in crisis, then trafficked into the United States with fake documentation. The children were placed with operatives in the network who posed as adoptive families, moved through school systems to create the appearance of normal childhoods, and then moved again when anyone started asking questions. Some children were eventually sold to people who wanted to adopt without going through legitimate channels, and were willing to pay premium prices for healthy young children with fabricated backgrounds. Others disappeared into domestic servitude, or worse situations that investigators were still trying to trace. The law office records included names and photos of the children, along with the various identities they'd been given. Emma Carolak's real name was Catalina Ruiz. She was originally from Guatemala, taken from her mother at age 4, under the pretense of a better life and education in America, then trafficked through the network for 5 years. The FBI used the law office records to track down current and recent placements. They found 8 children who were still in active placements with network operatives, posing as adopted children in families that appeared normal on the surface. The raids happened simultaneously across 3 states, carefully coordinated to prevent anyone from fleeing or destroying evidence. FBI agents removed the 8 children from their fake families and placed them in protective custody. Jennifer Marks was arrested at her home in Connecticut, along with Raymond Pratt and 12 other individuals identified as key network operators. The operation made national news within hours. Multi-state child trafficking ring dismantled after school photographer notices pattern in class photos. My name was kept confidential initially, but parents and school administrators figured out quickly that I'd been the one who reported the anomalies. My phone started ringing constantly, reporters wanting interviews, parents demanding to know if their children had been photographed by someone involved in trafficking, school boards requesting emergency meetings. I stopped answering unknown numbers and hired a lawyer to handle media requests. Detective Chen called me 3 days after the raids to update me on Emma's case. They'd found her. She was alive, though not in good condition. The law office records showed she'd been sold 6 weeks ago to a couple in Nebraska who'd paid $50,000 for a private adoption of a young girl with no traceable history. The couple claimed they'd believed the adoption was legal and had no idea the child had been trafficked. They'd been charged with child trafficking and fraud. Emma was in a hospital recovering from malnutrition and trauma. Chen said she'd asked about the lady who took her school pictures, saying I'd been nice to her and made her feel normal for a few minutes. The comment broke me. This child had been moved through hell for 5 years, treated as property by a criminal network, and she remembered a school photographer being kind to her as one of the few positive moments. Chen said Emma would need extensive therapy and support, but she had living relatives in Guatemala who'd been searching for her since she was taken. The FBI was working with international agencies to verify the family connections and arrange reunification, if appropriate. Emma's mother had never stopped looking for her daughter, had filed countless reports with authorities in Guatemala and the U.S., but the trail had gone cold when Catalina disappeared into the adoption fraud system. The legal proceedings stretched over 18 months. Jennifer Marks and Raymond Pratt were the primary defendants, facing federal charges of child trafficking, fraud, kidnapping, and money laundering. The law office partners were charged as accessories and for falsifying adoption documents. The fake families who'd housed children were charged with varying degrees of involvement, some cooperating in exchange for reduced sentences, others fighting the charges claiming they'd been deceived too. The evidence was overwhelming, between the law office records, my photographs documenting children under multiple identities, and testimony from the rescued children about their experiences. Marks and Pratt tried to argue that they'd been facilitating adoptions for children who needed homes, that any fraud was unintentional paperwork errors. But prosecutors demolished those claims by showing the systematic nature of the operation and the financial records, proving they'd profited enormously from selling children. I testified at multiple trials, walking juries through my photo archives and explaining how I'd identified the patterns that revealed trafficking. Sitting in those courtrooms describing my work while looking at faces of traumatized children in evidence photos was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Marks and Pratt were both convicted on all counts and sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. The law office partners received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. The fake families received varying sentences based on their level of involvement, from probation for those who cooperated and showed genuine ignorance to 15-year sentences for those who'd actively participated in trafficking multiple children. The courts also ordered financial restitution to victims, though most of the money the network had made was gone, spent or hidden in accounts investigators couldn't access. The 8 children rescued during the raids were placed in foster care or reunified with biological families where possible. Emma was eventually reunified with her mother in Guatemala after months of legal proceedings and verification. I received a letter from Emma's mother through the FBI Victim Services Office. She'd written in Spanish with an English translation attached, thanking me for noticing what so many others had missed, for caring enough about a pattern in photographs to report it, for being the reason her daughter came home. She said Catalina was adjusting slowly, but was safe and loved, and they were building their life back together. The letter included a photo of Catalina with her mother, both smiling. Catalina looking healthier and younger somehow, like she'd been holding tension for years and finally released it. The school district hired me to conduct a comprehensive review of their enrollment processes, identifying gaps that had allowed trafficked children to be enrolled under false identities without raising flags. I worked with administrators to develop verification protocols and train staff to recognize warning signs of fraudulent enrollments. Other districts contacted me asking for similar reviews, and I found myself becoming an unexpected expert on identifying trafficking indicators in school systems. I partnered with anti-trafficking organizations to develop training programs for school photographers, teaching them to document not just faces, but concerning details that might indicate abuse or trafficking. We created a reporting system where photographers could flag concerns confidentially, allowing schools and authorities to investigate without putting children at risk. The program expanded to 12 states within 2 years, and other photographers started reporting suspicious patterns. 3 more trafficking networks were identified and dismantled based on photo evidence that photographers had been trained to recognize. I still work as a school photographer, but my perspective has changed completely. I see each face differently now, aware that behind every smile or lack of smile is a story I might not know. I look for the markers of children who aren't where they should be, who don't fit the patterns I've learned over years of photographing thousands of students. 5 years after I first noticed Catalina's face repeating through my archives, I received an invitation to a victim advocacy event in Washington, D.C. The event honored people who'd played roles in rescuing trafficking victims, and I was receiving an award for my contribution to identifying and dismantling the adoption fraud network. I almost didn't attend, feeling uncomfortable being celebrated for something that felt like basic human decency, noticing a child's face and asking questions. But the FBI agent who'd worked the case called me personally and said the survivors wanted me there, that it was important to them. I flew to D.C. and sat through an emotional ceremony where survivors shared their stories and advocates were recognized. When my name was called, I walked to the stage and accepted the award from a woman I didn't initially recognize. Then she spoke, and I realized it was Catalina, now 14 years old, speaking clear English with a Spanish accent. She'd traveled from Guatemala with her mother specifically for this event. She thanked me for seeing her when she'd felt invisible, for noticing that something was wrong when everyone else had looked past her, for caring about a pattern in photographs enough to make phone calls that saved her life and the lives of other children. Catalina introduced me to 3 other survivors from the network, all present at the ceremony with their families or foster families, all rebuilding their lives after being rescued. One young man, now 17, told me he remembered me photographing him at 2 different schools under 2 different names, remembered wondering if I would notice that something was wrong, hoping someone would see the fear in his eyes. He said he'd learned not to hope after a while, trained himself to look blank in photos so his captors wouldn't punish him for showing emotion. But seeing me receive this award gave him hope again that people did notice, that someone cared enough to act. After the ceremony, I met with FBI agents who'd expanded the investigation internationally, working with agencies in 6 countries to trace the full network and identify additional victims. They'd found over 60 children total who'd been trafficked through the adoption fraud system, though not all had been located yet. Some had aged out of the system and disappeared into adulthood, possibly still unaware that their entire childhood had been built on trafficking and false identities. The FBI had created a database of photographs and identifying information, hoping that someday those missing individuals might come forward or be identified by others who remembered them. I asked what had happened to the children who hadn't been reunified with biological families, the ones whose families couldn't be found or verified. An FBI victim specialist explained that those children were in long-term foster care or had been adopted by legitimate families after extensive therapy and legal proceedings. The process was slow and complicated, undoing years of trauma and false identities, helping children understand who they really were and where they'd come from. Some children didn't want to know their original identities, too damaged by the years of being moved and renamed to handle more changes. Others desperately wanted to find their biological families, but faced dead ends where records had been destroyed or families had died or moved without trace. The specialist said the psychological impact of being trafficked as a young child and given multiple identities was profound and lifelong. These children grew up never knowing who they really were, never having a stable sense of self, always aware at some level that the families they lived with weren't real. That kind of foundational trauma didn't heal easily or quickly. I drove to my studio after returning from D.C. and pulled up my current archive of school photos from the past semester. Thousands of faces, kids from kindergarten through 8th grade, all smiling or serious or bored in their individual portraits. I studied each face more carefully than I used to, looking past the surface to whatever might be underneath. Most were just kids being kids, exactly what they appeared to be. But I flagged 3 photos where something seemed off, children whose eyes didn't match their expressions, who held themselves with unusual stillness, who looked at the camera with something other than normal childhood emotions. I filed reports with the schools and with the FBI database, probably overreacting, probably seeing patterns where none existed, but I'd learned that sometimes the patterns were real, that sometimes the small details in photographs revealed truths that needed investigating. 2 of my 3 flagged reports turned out to be nothing concerning, just kids having bad days or dealing with normal family stress. The 3rd led to an investigation that found a child being severely neglected by guardians who'd fraudulently gained custody through a corrupt caseworker. The child was removed and placed in protective care. The caseworker was arrested. Another small piece of justice carved out of systematic failure. 10 years after finding Catalina's pattern in my archives, I received a message through the anti-trafficking organization I'd been working with. Catalina was now 19, attending university in Guatemala, studying social work with a focus on child welfare. She wanted to thank me again and update me on her life. She'd written, "You saw me when I felt invisible. You cared about a detail that seemed small, but was my whole life. Because you paid attention to faces in photographs, I got my mother back, and my real name, and my future. I'm studying to help other children who are invisible the way I was. I want to be someone who sees them and acts. Thank you for teaching me that one person paying attention can change everything." I printed the message and hung it in my studio, where I see it every day before photographing students. It reminds me why the work matters beyond getting good pictures for yearbooks and family albums. Sometimes a photograph captures more than a moment. Sometimes it captures evidence of harm or absence or wrongness that needs to be seen and acted upon. And sometimes the person looking at photographs years later, noticing patterns and asking questions, becomes the connection between a child's suffering and their salvation. That's not just photography. That's bearing witness and refusing to look away even when it would be easier to see only what's on the surface and move on to the next frame. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.